Welcome to the Sourcing Industry Landscape podcast, hosted by Don Tura, CEO and President of SIG.
Well, folks, welcome back to our podcast series. My name is Dawn Tura. I'm President and CEO of Sourcing Industry Group. And I am so excited. In our studio today is Kent Mahoney, Executive Vice President of North America for Proxima. So, Kent, there is so much I want to ask you because I know you're responsible for leading North America business, ensuring that services align closely with clients' most critical needs. I know you've driven procurement transformations on behalf of several major providers in the procurement services space. And you're proud to represent a firm like Proxima's depth of talent, knowledge, and client relationships, and excited to lead the continued rapid growth in the U.S. for the inevitable future. So you've got a lot to live up to in your bio. So I can't wait to start unpacking this with you. Yeah. But before we get started, folks, we are going to take a quick break for a word from our sponsor. When we will return, we're going to drive into the concept of procurement is growing their role in innovation and recovery. So stay tuned.
What is Sig University? We are an inclusive, internationally recognized university whose mission is to advance the procurement profession while enabling students to transform their careers through our world-class certifications. Sig University offers industry-recognized certifications programs, each offering a unique set of competencies and skills that sourcing and risk professionals need to be successful. The programs provide advanced training in subjects like strategic sourcing, supplier management, third-party risk management, intelligent automation, and more. Sig University is committed to academic excellence, which is why our students are trained alongside an international cohort, engage in discussion forums, and learn from senior practitioner faculty who leverage their deep industry experience with real-world case studies. Why Sig University? It was created originally at the request of SIG members. We knew there was a lot of training out there, but nothing designed around the ever-evolving skills and competencies that the modern sourcing and risk professional needs. The program was created through collaborating with dozens of industry experts to create a curriculum that is bold, fresh, and applicable to this day and age. If you're looking to advance your knowledge and your career, join us at SIG University.
So Ken, just for our audience, just share a little bit about who Proxima is. I know this isn't a commercial for it or anything like that, but I always like to set the context. I think that's helpful.
Yeah, sure. Happy to. So Proxima is the leading global procurement consultancy. We are a specialist firm, so the only kind of services we provide are those that are related to procurement, which we think of as the source to pay life cycle. We've been in business for over 27 years, started off as a UK-based firm where we're still very much the dominant player in that market, and moved into the US market about 15 or so years ago. We've grown in this market by leaps and bounds. There's an incredible amount of demand for our services. Part of that's been spurred by the pandemic, but I won't say that we were hurting for business before either. We at this stage are roughly 300 strong. We operate in three major markets, private and public sector in the UK, and then private sector solely in the US. We work with four of the Fortune 20. We work with companies in all different sectors, all different sizes, but principally what we do for our clients is we help them manage their spend more wisely. And if you think about a day and age where 70% of most firms' revenues are being spent with external suppliers, that's a topic that's very much front of mind for most executives.
Yeah, it's funny that most executives or most people think that if you just do a headcount reduction, you're going to get the biggest savings, when really the payroll is not as large of a spend as the external spend on commodities and services. No. So yeah, you're absolutely spot on. But let's talk about the role of innovation, because I've been in this industry for a long time, and I think you have too. And there was a time where procurement was not seen as strategic. They certainly were not seen as innovative. In fact, I think we were called roadblocks, or the group you have to do business with, even if you don't want to. Mm-hmm. So can you talk a little bit, let's talk about your career, how you got to Proxima. And I understand this is your second time with Proxima. And then let's talk about the evolution of procurement as well. So let's talk about your career first.
Okay, yeah, happy to. So let's see. I've spent maybe with the exception of a couple of years out of school, the entirety of my career in procurement consulting and services businesses. I got my start in this side of the world with a company called ICG Commerce, which was one of the very first firms to really found themselves on the procurement as a pure play service. ICG Commerce is very much a BPO house, grew up through that organization, did everything from specific consulting engagements on one or two categories of spend all the way up to running, large global BPO engagements with hundreds of people and managing billions of dollars of spend. So really got a lot of exposure and experience across the business and across every flavor of procurement. Eventually ICG Commerce turned into Procurement and was then eventually acquired by Accenture. I did a couple of other little bits and bobs, and that's when I found myself at Proxima for the first time back in 2013, 2014. There, I was working to manage some of the accounts out on the West Coast. Had a great time with that, but a lot of times people ask me, well, hey, why were you at Proxima for such a short time, and why'd you come back? I was there for a relatively short time because I had a 1-year-old at home and I was flying between Orlando and LA every single week. And sometimes you got to make a decision for the family. So that was me, which makes me one of the few people to ever join IBM to improve their work-life balance, which I did, but it was fun. It was a great 5 years at IBM. I was an exec within their procurement services practice. Again, focused primarily on procurement BPO solutions. And then came back to Proxima in May of 2019, first to lead sales for the US business, and then to lead the division overall in November of last year.
Okay, so explain this to me. You had one child and you decided to stay on the road, but now you have 4, so now you've decided to go back on the road?
Yeah, I will say the advantage of the kind of role that I'm in now versus a consulting delivery role is consulting delivery, you're on site with the client 4 days a week, every single week.
Right.
In my role, I'm mostly going out to go and visit, well, not so much over the past year, but prior to COVID, going out and visiting key clients, going to steering committee and governance meetings, doing sales related presentation work and things like that, and less so just gone 4 days a week, every week. So it's a nice balance.
I like that. So, when you started out, ICG Commerce was groundbreaking in its day, but that's old news. Mm-hmm. And we have changed so dramatically. So for us to say procurement and innovation in the same sentence, no one would have believed it 20 years ago. And so can you tell me now about what is the role of procurement within innovation? Do you really believe that we have a seat at that table? And do you think we can deliver value there?
Well, yes to all fronts. I'll go into a little bit more detail. So one is, yes, I think procurement is absolutely finding itself with a seat at tables that it didn't used to have. And some of that has been brought on by the advent of the pandemic, the focus on companies trying to find any and all methods of cost reduction, optimizing their cost base, but then also on some of the very unique supply challenges that the pandemic has brought about. And so what you're seeing now is you're seeing a host of procurement leaders that all of a sudden have greater attention from the rest of the C-suite. Some of those leaders will find themselves with the toolkit to be able to take advantage of that opportunity. Others will probably find themselves not having a seat at that table for much longer if they don't have anything of value to bring. So when we talk about innovation and what the real role of procurement should be in a mature function, for me, it is a lot about not just cost savings, not just about controlling expenditures or providing a governance or a point of process. It's really about ensuring that that company is able to extract the maximum amount of value out of its supplier relationships. And that's really what procurement is all about. And so there's a number of different ways that you do this. Sometimes it's just simply making sure that you're not paying more than you should be for certain goods and services. But more often than not, it's making sure that you're really nurturing those strategic supplier relationships to drive innovation specifically. And for us, we have this concept that we talk about a lot called customer centricity. And it has to do with the notion of really, really skilled procurement professionals are able to not just go to their stakeholders and say, what do you want me to do? Because stakeholders will say, well, get it to me faster and cheaper and with the least amount of red tape possible. What really skilled procurement professionals need to focus on is thinking about how do I understand my internal stakeholders, customer, as well as they understand them, so I can really get at the underlying need of what it is that they're trying to go out and buy. Because then what you have is, rather than being an order taker, you are instead understanding the need, and then you are the conduit to external market solutions for that stakeholder base and for the business to solve whatever that underlying problem is.
Yeah, so I used to do procurement consulting in my past life. And one of the things I thought was just brilliant was, when we first started having telephones on airlines, in the back of the seats. Remember those days? You'd pull it out with that weird cord, and you'd swipe your credit card. That was actually created by a supplier. It was not created by the airlines. And when American Airlines first did it, they had a supplier who kept knocking on their door saying, I think we can put phones on your planes. And they're like, yeah, no. And they finally got a back door in through procurement to say, hey, we have a solution. We think we can drive revenue for you, and it will help innovate and show that you are a more modern airline than other airlines. And so I've always used that in my mind to say, as a procurement professional, we are at the front line with all these suppliers, and every supplier has hundreds, if not thousands of clients. And so they see things that we can't see through our, internal view. And so I've always really embraced when a supplier comes to me and says, I've got a great idea, but that isn't the way most procurement professionals act. They don't pick up the phone because they're afraid it's a supplier on the other end. How do we get over that thought, into embracing it?
Yeah, they aren't, and it's challenging as well, because you still see many procurement functions, and I'll delineate a little bit between the directs or the COGS space versus indirect spend, right? Because I think in the COGS space, most organizations of a certain size have made significant investments in the talent, the market intelligence, the process, et cetera, related to that spend, because it's core to their business. It's strategic, right? Fewer firms, and you might be surprised to find how many I encounter that are just really gigantic firms, but they haven't really invested in an indirect spend management capability within their procurement function. And so what you end up with is an indirect spend sourcing organization that doesn't have a lot of power, doesn't have very strong relationships. And so they are being functionally looked at as a process point, and not as a source of innovation or business improvement. And what you find as well is, because there's been a lack of investment in those departments, companies are often staffed with generalists, right? So people that were serving some other function of the business, and then they get drafted into procurement. And when you have generalists trying to engage with the supply market and drive credibility with stakeholders, that kind of ends up becoming an almost counter-virtuous cycle, because you lose credibility anytime you walk into, say, I don't know, a senior director of marketing's office and say, hey, I want to beat up your suppliers for a better rate, right? Because that's not the same language. That's not understanding their need. And without that investment in specialist category talent, most organizations will find themselves caught in that loop.
Yeah, I think so too. So let's take a minute and talk about the CFO and the relationship with the CPO. Do you deal a lot with the CFOs in your role?
I do, yes. The reason being that typically what we find is, when it comes to actual ability to drive transformation in organizations, the CFOs just tend to have a ton more authority and ability to make that happen than a CPO does. There are certainly exceptions to that rule. There are chief procurement officers that have very prominent positions. They speak regularly with the rest of the C-suite and the board, but by and large, CFOs do tend to have a little bit more ability. The other reason why we typically tend to speak with CFOs quite a lot is because cost reduction is always on the table for them. And while it's not always the end goal for a procurement organization, as I just discussed, it's a great entry point, right? Especially when you're looking to try and transform the function. Now, the challenge with that, though, is that CFOs are going to be less familiar with the concept of really solid indirect spend management than a CPO will be. And so there's often a lot of education that has to happen, unless they're just really in tune with the market and what's going on, to make them see the value that can be driven out of that.
Yeah, so there really, in some ways, there are three buckets of spend. We have our cost of goods sold, which we think we have a handle on. We have our indirect spend, and then we've got this long tail. And lots and lots of suppliers and very small contracts. And it sure isn't sexy. Nobody wants to play in the tail because it's not fun. It's not the multi-million-dollar agreements. It's the 10,000 here, 50,000 there. So are you seeing more companies starting to address the tail as well? Because it is fraught with risk, because we don't play in it and we don't analyze it.
Yeah, it is fraught with risk. We see a number of different strategies that can be deployed and are being deployed within the tail. Some of those end up being unfortunately, somewhat manual efforts to collect the data, analyze it, and find a way to incorporate that spend into existing preferred supplier agreements that are already sitting out there within strategic sourcing. Sometimes it's simply a matter of getting the right sort of rec to PO platform in place so that you can make sure that you're channeling demand to the correct sources, because 9 times out of 10 people aren't deliberately spending money with non-preferred suppliers. They probably don't know they exist, or the process is such that it's completely inconvenient to go through it. And so what we've seen is tons of entrants in the market that are specifically focused around managing the tail more from a technology perspective, because that tends to be a way for procurement to be able to get their arms around the spend, be able to have it be more actively managed and controlled without necessarily creating a process or a bunch of red tape that prevents the business from being able to acquire the goods and services it needs to operate. So that's been a big focus, I think, is figuring out how do we address that with technology more and with manual less.
Yeah. So maybe, using AI to crawl through the tail, using tools that can help automate a lot of the tail spend and the reporting of it. I mean, it just seems, I never wanted to touch it as a consultant. It was never exciting. It was never fun. And, and we always had this low hanging fruit. But at the end of the day, especially with cyber and third party risk, if we don't do some kind of analysis of the tail, I just feel that we're hanging ourselves out to dry. So I was just wondering on your feeling about that.
No, I think that's 100% correct. I mean, you can't have spend that you don't understand, because that's what really creates risk. If you don't know where you're spending the money, if you don't understand the kinds of organizations that you're spending money with, then that creates very real risk for an organization. That's why anti-money laundering practices are becoming so popular right now, as an example, right? You want to make sure that you know the suppliers you're doing business with, that they can be trusted, and that their actions won't potentially reflect negatively on your organization as a whole. And that's now even extending, outside of just potential fraudulent or illegal or unethical activity, to now organizations focusing more on how do we make sure that we not only have a very diverse supplier base, but that the suppliers that we work with themselves also have a focus on things like supplier diversity in their own supply chain. And if you don't know who you're spending money with, then it's very difficult to do that.
Yeah. And I never would be someone who would want to let a pandemic go to waste. I mean, there has to be something good that came out of this. So do you think it got the attention of the C-suite? Is it the supply chain resiliency? Is it the way, we have some CPOs, I swear to God, were wearing Superman capes because suddenly things that were not considered direct spend, like PPE, was suddenly front and center. And, they were procuring things as direct spend that they had never ever had to worry about before. So do you think that is our chance, is to build more walls, more solid supply chain channels, to build the resiliency? Or do you think that that's just going to create a bunch of redundancy and inventory and stuff like that? What are you guys consulting to clients and saying today?
Yeah, we are placing a fair amount of focus on building a more resilient supply chain. And some of that is redundancy, but it's not necessarily enacted or implemented redundancy. It's more kind of having alternate supply base there ready for when you need it. You'll never solve 100% of the sort of capacity and production issues that you'll hit when you hit a major event like a COVID, right? But I think you could reasonably accommodate at least half of the difference by having the correct supply chain in place. The other thing that we advise clients on quite a bit is the ability to have a much more agile procurement function, because the best way to deal with things when nobody really knows what's going to happen year by year, and the best way to deal with surprising events, is to be able to very quickly pivot the focus of your organization to address the needs that are most critical to the business. So if all of a sudden the next COVID hits and you have to buy a bunch of face masks and antibacterial lotion, then, do you have the wherewithal to do that? Or is everyone still just rooted in a very, very kind of old school 80s and 90s category management approach? They don't have the flexibility and agility or the market know-how to be able to pivot like that. So a lot of what we've been talking about lately is category management the correct structure anymore? Or do procurement organizations need to realign themselves so they can be a bit more agile?
Oh, I like that. That's very interesting. So, all right, you're going to have to tell me more about that as you guys go through. And are you doing any white papers or studies on that right now?
Yeah, I do think we have a white paper out there. I'll have to kick it to you, but I don't remember the name of it offhand. But I have seen a white paper or two come out of us on the topic of supply chain resiliency. And I think as well, I'll give you a really interesting example about how organizations can kind of pivot from being just a category management structured organization to being much more focused on the needs of the business. And without mentioning their name, it's a large global hotel chain, right? Mm-hmm. And they traditionally were organized the same way everyone else is, right? They've got a category director for facilities, and they have one for marketing services, and they got teams underneath them, and then they have like an analytics function and a process optimization function, everything else that's great, right? But what they were finding is, as they looked out across their franchise-owned locations, they were really only managing about 2% of that total spend. And we're talking tens of billions of dollars of spend that's all being used to build, refurbish, et cetera, new potential hotel locations. And so, one of the cool things that they've been working on is figuring out how do we pivot from the category-based structure to more of a solution or service-based structure that's specifically geared to solve for problems or processes that their customers, the franchisees, will need to run. So now it's geared around, how do we have a structure that's ready to deliver as a service line or as a solution, procurement services related to the stand-up of a new hotel, to refurbishment of an old hotel, to the closing down and disposition of all the material assets for one that's going out of business, right? And so by being able to kind of target more towards service lines, they're operating, frankly, a lot more in the way that we operate, and as a consulting services business, and less so as an old school sort of internal department. And it's having a huge effect.
That is really cool. So we are running close to being out of time. So I just have one last question for you. So if you were able to go back and talk to your younger self who was just starting out after college, what advice would you have given yourself? What do you wish you knew then that you know now?
Yeah, I think for me, it would be recognizing how critical a strong sales skill set is to the procurement profession. I think a lot of times, and we deal with this a lot in our own business, right? Because in consulting, everybody has to be thinking about what do I do next for the client, right? And we draw people a lot of the times from procurement organizations at big giant companies, great legacies from industry. A lot of times, I think procurement professionals feel iffy about the notion of sales because they're used to interacting with sales professionals as they're doing their buying. And they feel like that's a different side of the table from where they operate, right? And I think for me, the advice I would give is figure out sooner that the ability to sell internally to your stakeholders to get your point across makes a huge amount of difference to how successful you can be in a procurement career. Because ultimately, finding the ways in which you could save money turns out to be pretty easy most of the time. Working with your business stakeholders to convince them to change the behaviors or take the actions to realize that benefit is a much more difficult task. And I think especially now, as we kind of sit on this opportunity to increase the influence that procurement has, you've got to stay on that sales skill set and use that as an opportunity to take advantage.
Well, I can't agree more. So, I'm a bean counter historically. I'm a recovered CPA. And to me, when I first got into consulting, I was like, it's right here. It's black and white. The numbers tell you that this is the right answer. And I just couldn't figure out why everyone just didn't just jump to the black and white answer. And it took me a while to realize it's all about the people. That if I don't convince the people to want to buy on this contract, no matter what good I did in my consulting, we're never going to drive that change. And so I can't agree more. I had to get out of my bean counter head and learn the people side of the business, that you learn to be able to engage and sell up, down, and across the organization to be able to drive, long-term change that's really going to transform an organization. So yeah, I needed to learn that too. So if you go back to tell your younger self, pull me aside and let me know that too, earlier in my career.
Yeah, sounds like a plan.
So folks, I am talking today with Kent Mahoney. He is Executive Vice President of North America for Proxima. And Kent, I have so enjoyed my time with you today. So thank you for joining us. And then send us a link to those white papers and we'll make sure to embed the link so people can find those and follow up with you.
Terrific. Thanks for having me, Don. I really appreciated the discussion.
Oh, it was such a pleasure. So nice getting to know you. And hopefully I'll see you in Carlsbad for our fall summit.
Sounds good. All
right. Take care. Thank you, everyone. And please tune in to the podcast series. It's often. It's available on YouTube. It's available on iTunes. It's available on Sirius. All kinds of places. Tune in. You can find our podcast. So join us again. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening. Subscribe to the Sourcing Industry Landscape podcast through iTunes or your favorite podcast app. Want to nominate someone for an interview? Email us at info@sig.org.